And for example, so meaning that while Mercosur negotiations were going on in Congress, before the approximation of Brazil and Argentina in the 80s, we did not see too much congressional interference, only sectoral interference on matters such as automobiles, dairy products, sugar. But in general, there was somewhat of a consensus between the legislative branch and the executive branch on Brazilian foreign policy to the region, mainly to Argentina and to Mercosur with Paraguay and Uruguay. So Congress's role was initially discreet on Mercosur and became more noticeable on Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, on FTAA, because then you put a country to the north of Rio Grande in the game, and Brazil's Congress began to show more interest on Brazil's trade policies. There were a lot of proposals of referendum against FTAA. So you had a result on the name of the referendum that actually proposed in Congress, saying that, we should have a referendum against the FTAA. Quite curious. And also a lot of propositions on to implement a TPA, a Trade Promotion Authority model in Brazil's Congress, to try to give Congress the authority of authorizing or not the president to seek these agreements outside the region. And also Congress has become more aggressive on issues such as trade with China and the Bolivian gas issue, and also the Venezuela's admission to Mercosur. Much of this has to do, of course, with the general government opposition battle, and also with pressure groups, increasing influence on congressional activities, pressure groups such as Fiesp and agricultural pressure groups that work along with political parties to try to gain more influence on foreign policy. Just an example of this new role of Congress role in foreign policy making. Yesterday there was this big and heated debate on Brazilian Senate between Celso Amorim, the foreign ministry, and also Tasso Gereissati, senator from PSDB. On Celso Amorim basically said that I hope my candidate wins, his candidate being Dilma Rousseff, because he is affiliated recently to PT. So that gave a little unheard of discussion on foreign policy, heated foreign policy on Brazilian elections. The second driver, political parties, the second domestic driver of Brazilian foreign policy. PT's left-wing and south-south foreign policy was faced with criticism from PSDB and PFL, or the opposition. These parties, however, they lack a clear foreign policy message. They criticize PT's foreign policy or ideological rhetoric or the priorities with India, with poor or developing countries, but that does not mean that they stand for they don't have a free trade agenda. You cannot say that PSDB is a pro-free trade party. So they criticize, but they don't give a clear message on what's the alternative. But also on that note, of the importance of political parties, PT recently had an idea to create a foreign policy council in Brazil to try, for two reasons that I interpret. One, to try to curb Itamaraty's influence on foreign policy, and the second one is to try to maintain Lula's legacy after he's gone, or not, from the administration. But that's actually, I believe that there's no chance, or slight chance, of this council coming to be, but still it shows that all political parties are beginning to become more interest in foreign policy. And the third and final domestic driver is the executive branch agencies. More agencies are involved in the decision-making process, kind of like the bureaucratic politics model that not only Itamaraty deals with foreign policy, but also the Ministry of Trade and Development, and also agricultural ministries and specific issues ministries such as science and technology, environment, and the list goes on. So you have also an example of the Defense Ministry in Brazil had an important document 2 years ago on Brazilians' defense strategy. This document had no participation of a diplomat on its writing whatsoever, and it mentioned foreign policy issues such as Brazil's resistance to ratify the additional protocol to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So you have this major document, strategic document of Brazilian government that had no participation of Itamaraty beforehand. They entered afterwards, but there was a lot of debate on that issue. So how has President Lula dealt with these domestic drivers? First, his charisma that was mentioned here, leadership and popularity, has shielded his foreign policy options from domestic and international criticisms. Lula has no problem talking to Obama one day and having a photo op with Ahmadinejad the next day. Lula uses some of his foreign policy actions to satisfy his own political party, the PT. Marco Aurelio Garcia, who's one of the political leaders of PT, has a prominent role in Brazil's foreign policy today. Also, Samuel Pinheiro Guimarães was also very praised by PT before because he was the main person against FTAA negotiations back in the 90s. And finally, Celso Amorim's affiliation to PT recently and his candidate, Dilma Rousseff. The South-South rhetoric is also very welcomed by PT, and a mild anti-American stance on a few issues, and the ideas such as the creation of a foreign policy council. So that's one way that Lula contains his own party stance on foreign policy. And but there's also one interesting fact that also Garman mentioned, that's governing coalition. Lula has a broad and diverse governing coalition, and he has forged the largest cabinet ever in Brazil's history. Just to have an idea, Sarney had 32 ministers. Collor had 29, Itamar 29, Fernando Henrique Cardoso 33, and Lula 39. Some might say 40, but it's quite large. As a result, on foreign policy issues, as on other policies, as a matter of fact, President Lula's administration has worked like a divisive cabinet, an excess of opinions from economic and trade policies to defense matters. On environmental and climate change debate, for example, you had, if you watched Brazil's Globo News, the news channel in Brazil, you could watch two ministers fighting live on TV. One defending that Brazil should be more progressive on climate change targets, and the other one saying that no, we shouldn't. So you had that live on TV, and you can project that division into many issues, including economic policies before Antonio Palocci and against José Dirceu and so on. So that excess of opinion has been one main characteristic of Lula's administration. But an important note is that Lula's charisma and also his labor union experience helped him deal with that kind of diversity, because his labor union experience is somewhat to handle with that every day, with people saying different things, and basically at the end you decide what's going to be better for the whole organization. So Lula floats above all these different opinions, and he picks the one that fits best at the right moment, at the right time. The example being climate change negotiations again. He chose Dilma Rousseff to head the delegation in Copenhagen, and she was well known to be anti-environment before. She had many disputes with Marina Silva, who was the environmental minister before, and Dilma was energy ministry, for example. So Lula, and I saw many of the speeches of all the ministries in Brazil dealing with the climate change issue, and you had 3 or 4 different positions, basically. And at the end, Brazil, Dilma, she took the nice role of trying to be more pro-environment, and had succeeded, actually, in Copenhagen, despite there being no treaty in Copenhagen.